How bad is this? Are we okay? I feel like this is a lot for a small room, but welcome to the Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series. I am delighted to introduce and welcome Rebecca Walker. She is a professor of social medicine and philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill. She's a philosopher of medicine, and her work addresses animal ethics, health justice, genome ethics, and bioethics concepts and methodologies. She has been co-editor on a number of books, including Understanding Health Inequalities and Justice and The Social Medicine Reader, and has a book forthcoming titled, or currently titled, Of Mice and Primates, Virtue, Ethics, and Animal Research. At UNC, Dr. Walker is also faculty in the Center for Bioethics, a fellow in the Parr Center for Ethics, and a member of the Standing Advisory Committee for the Department of Public Policy, where she's also an adjunct professor. And importantly, she was a Greenwald Fellow in Bioethics and Health Policy here at the Berman Institute a little bit ago. So Rebecca will be talking with us about One Health, One Ethic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Walker.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm just delighted to be here. Really appreciate the invitation, and just trying to figure out which way to move advanced slides forward. Right click, probably? No. Just be left. Oh, there's a keyboard down here. Oh, good. All right, anyway. Thank you. Delighted to be here. Lovely to see so many familiar faces in the room. Very excited to hear your thoughts about this topic, and I'll just dive right into it. So, all right. So here's what you can look for in the talk. So I'll open with the idea that the purported goals of One Health are belied by the divergent systems of research oversight that we have in human and animal subject research. The typical approach to the way that human and animal subject research is overseen in divergent ways, within bioethics in particular, is to say, well, animals should get at least some of the protections that we have for humans because of their moral status. And I'm going to take a bit of a different approach. So here's my approach today. So I think the worry is the mere fact that there are separate ethical frameworks. I think that is not very well justified. Moreover, I think we should look at potential justifications beyond moral status and see if those work. I think those also do not work very well, so I'll talk about those. And it's a two-way street. Not only should animal research benefit from human subject oversight protections, but animal research ethics can also shed some light on human subject research ethics problems, and this goes back to some work I've done with my colleagues at UNC thinking about phase 1, human studies. And the road ahead, I think, should be a more unified system. I'm not going to offer you such a system. It's really a job for a commission. So we'll see as far as we can get. Okay, so One Health. There are a lot of different definitions of One Health. There's no sort of universally accepted definition. This one gets a lot of traction from the CDC website. Collaborative, multi-sectoral, and transdisciplinary approach with the goal of achieving optimal health outcomes, recognizing the interconnections between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. And the notion of One Health under the name One Health really comes from a 2004 conference where the Manhattan Principles were described. I'll come back to them at the end. But it's been a sort of an idea for quite a bit longer than that, more earlier on under the idea of one medicine. And so back to the 19th century, you have Virchow who coined the term zoonosis for infectious diseases that pass between humans and animals, although interestingly, he rejected the germ theory of disease. And as all of you in this audience knows from your public health perspective, 60 to 75% of infectious and emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. And according to the World Organization for Animal Health, SARS-CoV-2, just to look at our most recent pandemic, those infections have been reported in over 23 non-human animal species, from the very big to the quite small. And there are many examples, even over the past 25 years or so, of the connections between human and animal health in recent epidemics. I won't go through these all, but basically there's a burden on human health, and that is conjoined with a burden on animal health, typically in the form of culling of animals in order to control for these kinds of infections. So if we have this goal of a sort of a more unified health system, thinking about human and animal health together, and if we need a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach, it's sort of remarkable just from that point of view that we have very different systems for oversight of human and animal research, because of course we need both human and animal research in order to move forward on those interconnected health goals. And these are just, some of the examples of the different offices that deal with human and animal subject oversight. But what I'm more interested in, because I'm a philosopher and I work in bioethics, is the way in which the very principles that guide these different realms of research are different. And I'm going to get into these a little bit. So this is just a sort of visual. We've got, of course, from the Belmont report, the 3 principles there. And we've got the 3 R's that come out of the principles of humane experimental techniques and have been advanced over the years in different, more sophisticated ways. So just quickly to take a step back, I think we're all on the same page here, but just a sort of big picture. Why is it important to have oversight of research uses of human and non-human animals? Of course, we have history of different problematic events that led people to think that scientists couldn't do this all by themselves. They needed a little bit of help in sort of managing oversight. But even more importantly, well, not more importantly, but in addition, there's just the mere fact that the purpose of research is for generalizable knowledge that can serve society and is not necessarily oriented to the benefit of the individual, whether that individual is human or a non-human animal. And so you need some additional oversight. And we've taken this mid-level principles approach to ethical oversight. We're not trying to appeal to a big moral theory. We're not trying to appeal to utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics. We've taken this sort of, respect for autonomy, beneficence, justice in the human case and the 3 R's in the animal case, partly because we can get some wide shared agreement on these principles without alluding to any specific sort of general value framework, and because these principles can be instrumentalized in order to apply to specific research requirements and then interpreted in context and, if need be, balanced against each other. So given that, then we've come up with these 2 different sets of principles. So for human subject research ethics, we have these norms of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, where this is all like you could do this in your sleep, but nevertheless, just so we're all on the same page, respect for persons, we have participation is voluntary, including informed consent and assent, and we've got protection for people with diminished autonomy. For beneficence, we've got the idea that we need to reduce risk in any study, and then we want to make sure that the ratio of risk to the benefit, to the subject, and or to society is favorable. And for justice, we want to make sure that we have fair subject selection, and think about the equitable distribution of research benefits. Animal research norms are quite different. So for animal research norms, we have this umbrella concept of welfare, where we say we want to do the best for the animals that we can in terms of their well-being, given the needs of the science in which we're engaging them. So welfare is the umbrella concept, but not that we just need to make sure that all of these animals are doing as well as they can possibly be. It's doing as well as they can possibly be, given the constraints of the science goals and given the constraints of the research setting. You need to have the animals in the vivarium 24/7. They're not going to be like out and about in the world, etc. So we have that umbrella concept, and then under that we have these ideas of reduction, refinement, and replacement. So for reduction, we want to reduce the number of animals that are used to those that are needed for the research goals. There's an additional question of the extent to which we look at overall reduction of the use of animals in research. For refinement, mainly that's oriented towards modifying and lessening painful or distressing interventions. And then also it's been used to think about improving housing and husbandry. For replacement, you can have absolute replacement, where you replace the use of live animals altogether in research, or you can have relative replacement, which is the idea that you would use a less sentient species, whatever that means. I'll just wave my hands at that, but you might use a mouse instead of a primate, or perhaps a zebrafish instead of a mouse. Okay. So with those two sets of principles in mind, I want to just go through some of the significant ethical differences, because those are important going forward. So with animal research, you've got welfare that's constrained by the needs of science. So if you've got a study that requires that animals have a certain level of discomfort or suffering, that will be justifiable as long as it's appropriate to the science. If you had a similar level of suffering or discomfort in human studies, you would just say those are unethical studies, we're not going to do them. So I don't know, you might think back to something like the smallpox vaccine research that Jenner did in the mid-18th century with an 8-year-old child who was the son of his gardener. He inoculated him with smallpox to see if the cowpox that he had been given earlier worked in order to keep him from getting smallpox. And thank goodness that worked. But these days, you might just say that would be an unethical study. That's not something we're going to do. Okay, so you've got that. Then you've got another important difference is the difference between a risk-benefit evaluation and a harm reduction approach. So with a risk-benefit evaluation, you say, well, what are the risks to human subjects, and are those justified in terms of the potential for benefit? With animal studies, you typically know going in what the harms are going to be, although not always, and you say, well, we're gonna reduce those to the lowest point that we can. Of course, there's no consent or assent for animal studies, no consideration of fair subject selection or distribution of benefits in animal studies. And human studies consider beneficence, typically in terms of risk and benefit, but not as much specifically in terms of welfare and the 3 Rs. Okay, so other recent approaches to the problem of animal research oversight protections, some of the most important ones here, especially Beecham and DeGrazia, who've come out with their principles of animal research ethics in 2019. They've proposed some revisions to the 3 Rs approach that I think are very valuable in terms of a revised set of principles with 2 core values of social benefit and animal welfare, and then they spell those out in different ways. There is the approach of saying, hey, actually those Belmont report principles work pretty well for animals too. Let's use those for animals and just apply them in that case. And as I said, I'm going to take a different approach in the next, I guess, 25 minutes in thinking about, is the difference itself justified? And if not, how can we move forward? Okay, so what are the different ways that we could justify having a completely different set of ethical principles for human and non-human animal subject research? You could say that there are moral status differences between humans and animals that justify this different approach. I think that's typically where most of the emphasis has been. You could say, well, actually leaving moral status completely aside, there are capacity and interest differences between these two groups that mean that they should have a different set of oversight principles. Or you could say that there are structural differences in the research enterprises that themselves mean that you have to take a different approach to the ethics. That is an approach that I will get to, but I want to go through the other two first, hopefully more quickly. So, moral status differences. So the usual philosophical approach is to say, hey, is there a difference between human and non-human animal moral status? And typically philosophers have said not per se. So if you are a utilitarian like Peter Singer, you might say, look, what makes an entity have moral status is that it has interests, because you can't pay attention to something's needs and interests unless it actually has interests. And in order for something to have interests, it has to be sentient. And so the threshold for considering other beings is sentience. But of course, it's not just humans that have sentience. And he means that in the sense of pain, being able to experience pains and pleasures. So you wouldn't say only humans are sentient, and so it's not the case that only humans have moral status. You could take a rights-based approach to thinking about this. You have a very similar type of argument with just a different threshold. So for Tom Reagan, for example, who takes a rights-based approach to thinking about animals, says that the threshold to having moral status is being the subject of a life, and if you're the subject of a life, then you ought not to be used as a mere means. And of course, not only human beings are a subject of a life in the sense of having a perspective on the world. And so it's not the case that only human beings have moral status. We can talk about all of that. I'm going to leave it aside because I think regardless of whether human of the human, non-human animal moral status differences or not, it's not clear to me how moral status could justify a completely different set of ethical concepts to guide research oversight. Why? Well, moral status presumably is either on-off or a matter of degree. For those of you who don't think that logic works that way, we can have another conversation, but let's just sit with that. So if it's on-off, then what does that mean for the fact that we have these different sets of principles? Well, I think the only plausible thing it could mean is that only respect and justice imply moral status. So in the human subjects oversight, we've got respect for persons and justice, and it's those principles that imply that human subjects have moral status. In the animal subject example, we've got welfare as our umbrella principle, but that concept doesn't necessarily itself imply that animals have any moral status. Instead, you could say, well, the reason that we need to consider the welfare of animals is not for their own sake. So we're not interested in considering their needs and interests for the sake of them. Instead, we consider their needs and interests for the sake of the science. And if we think about it that way, it means that they don't themselves necessarily have any independent moral status. It's instrumentalized, their welfare is instrumentalized for the good of the science. So healthier animals lead to better experimental results. It's better for humans in terms of virtue to treat animals kindly and not cruelly. So these are all reasons why you might think, well, actually, if moral status is on off, and that's the rationale for why you have these different sets of moral principles, what that essentially means is that animals have no moral status, only humans have moral status. I don't know if you're going to like that, but I think that's the only justification that you can get for there being a different set of principles if moral status is on off. It is itself, though, belied by some of the oversight rhetoric for thinking about non-human animals. So if you look at least to the European Union, you have the claim that animals have intrinsic value that must be respected. So that is a claim about them having moral status themselves. If you look farther away to the Swiss, it gets even more serious in terms of moral value. So there's a requirement to protect dignity, where dignity means inherent worth of the animal that has to be respected. That's another very clear statement of animal moral status. In the US, interestingly, the way in which the oversight works, it's not entirely clear that that's a statement that animals have intrinsic moral value themselves, as opposed to this more instrumental interpretation. So in the guide, it says, all who care for, use, or produce animals, blah, 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 must assume responsibility for their well-being. That's actually ambiguous between whether animals themselves have moral value or whether we just have an obligation to attend to their welfare, perhaps for the sake of the science, et cetera. So I think that we don't think that animals don't have any moral status. I think that we think that animals do have, so not to use the double negative, I think that we think typically that animals do have moral status. That's at least the common way to think about it these days. And so I'm going to leave this aside, but it's a possible interpretation of why this could be justified to say there's two different sets of principles. Okay, so moral status is either on off or a matter of degree. If it's a matter of degree, maybe that makes sense of some of the differences in terms of the oversight. So for example, C. elegans, there are no regulations guiding their use. Moving up to zebrafish, the Public Health Service policy covers them, but not the Animal Welfare Act. We go a little farther up to mice, who should be covered by the Animal Welfare Act, but aren't, should be in the sense that they are warm-blooded vertebrates who would otherwise fall under the protection of the Animal Welfare Act, but they're carved out. Dogs have some special protections under the Animal Welfare Act for exercise. And then, as Jeffrey Kahn well knows, there's special limits and now really pretty much a ban on research using chimpanzees. And then humans maybe have special protections. And so you might say, well, moral status is a matter of degree, and that's sort of reflected in the oversight. Okay, but here's the problem. I think moral status being a matter of degree could explain some of the differences in animal protections that you see, as I've just described. But I have one worry about moral status being a matter of degree that I'm gonna just say and not justify. But I'm really worried about moral status being a matter of degree because I think it ushers in contingent protections for different groups. So my group is protected as long as the group a little bit above me doesn't need something, and then my protections get overridden. So I'm worried about that sort of just structurally. But even more so, I think that if moral status is a matter of degree, it might make sense of some of the differences along the line, but it would be a matter of degree kind of from the nematode worm up to the human. It doesn't really make sense that when you get past non-human primates, you suddenly have a completely different shift in terms of the ethical principles. So I don't think it makes sense of that. Okay, so we're going to move on from moral status. I think this is the funniest animal cartoon ever, but I'm glad to hear some giggles in the audience. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go through this extremely quickly because I want to get to the next point. So maybe we could just leave moral status completely aside and say, well, the reason why we have these different sets of principles is that animals and humans just have different needs and interests, and that's how we can justify this difference. And welfare in terms of animals is used to target protections to various needs and interests of different species. And to a certain extent, I can sort of start to get on board with that. So you might think, well, part of respect for persons is the idea of informed consent. And informed consent is a way to respect autonomy. And you might think that only humans are autonomous in the kind of way where you would need informed consent. And so that makes sense of why you might have respect for persons only for humans, but not for non-human animals. Here's the problem, though. Respect for persons also includes protections for non-autonomous persons. So children are included in research with assent and special protections, but there are no similar special protections for non-autonomous animals who may have a similar interest in avoiding harm. So it doesn't really work in terms of just following the needs and interests of the creature. Moreover, I think something similar holds with respect to thinking about justice. So in the Belmont report, you've got the idea that vulnerable groups shouldn't be included in research that could not benefit other members of their group. Children, of course, are allowed to participate in above minimal risk research without personal benefit when the goal is to improve treatment for children with a similar condition. And in the European Union, interestingly, they have a kind of a similar thing when it comes to the use of great apes, where they say you can provisionally use great apes in certain circumstances, but only if it's necessary for species protection. So you've got that kind of justice angle in there going on. But I think this idea could be generalized to other animal uses, the idea that animal use should benefit, in some cases at least, other members of the species and not only humans. So the principle is applicable even if it isn't applied. Okay, so why the different approaches? We've been through moral status differences, we've been through capacity and interest differences. So here's another thought. Maybe it's the structural differences in the research enterprises themselves that make sense of why we have these different sets of principles. So animal research occurs in confinement, in facilities and labs where animals live their entire lives. And that raises welfare issues. That makes sense of why we might be especially concerned with welfare when it comes to thinking about non-human animals. Furthermore, laboratory animals are typically owned by the study sites and institutions where they're used. And so it would be weird to say we need to have consent for their use. Moreover, animals don't benefit typically from the research they're involved in biomedical research. Of course, there is veterinary research as well. I'm not ignoring that altogether. You'll see, but typically they don't benefit from the research. The focus is on harm reduction instead of a risk-benefit analysis, and that makes sense given the structure of the research enterprise. Okay, so here's the problem. That also doesn't really work. So I want to consider two case studies. One is to think about companion animal research, pet research. Sometimes when I say companion animals, people think I'm only talking about like dog assistants or something like that, but talking about pets generally, and consider phase 1 healthy human volunteer research. So this was a longevity study in companion dogs. Rapamycin is a drug that was approved by the FDA for use in humans in immune suppressive and anti-cancer uses. But rodent studies and some other studies have also shown that rapamycin helps to extend life and health span. And so there was a randomized placebo control study of 600 healthy middle-aged companion dogs to see both if there are negative effects of the use of this drug and to see if there are long-term benefits for health and longevity, with the idea that maybe if we have a drug that works to help to expand animal life, perhaps it could also help to expand human life as well. So this study is an animal study, but it raises ethical issues that are very similar to what we see in a human subjects research ethics context. So what kind of analysis do we want? Do we want to just reduce the harms? I think not. I think we want to think about the risks to these healthy pets, healthy companion animals, in comparison with the potential for benefit. I think we want to have a pretty high bar to acceptable risk to animals in this kind of context. And we need to realize that there's a potential for benefit, both for the individual animals and for their owners or guardians. We also must get informed consent for a study like this. And when you get that kind of informed consent, obviously not from the dog themselves, but from their owners or guardians, you have to worry about similar kinds of things that you have to worry about in the human subject case. You have to worry about the potential for therapeutic misperception because this is an FDA-approved drug. You have to worry about the fact that the drug costs a lot and everybody already knows that there's a rumor that expands, that it expands lifespan for a dog. And so people will want to join the study because they want to get access to the drug that's expensive. You have to worry about justice and post-trial drug provision potentially in case the study is beneficial. And I think it's also true that whereas in the animal study case, typically euthanasia is considered a humane endpoint to a study where an animal is suffering or is otherwise having effects that are not in line with the study, that is not an acceptable endpoint for a study like this. And indeed, this is recently, I don't know if you've seen, but there's recently this company called Loyal has met the initial hurdle for conditional approval for a longevity drug for animals under an expanded umbrella. And so this is a sort of an ongoing set of issues. And the rapamycin study is also ongoing. It's a different company. And the FDA has recently just created draft guidance for thinking about the need for informed consent in these kinds of studies. Okay, so what's the other example? So the other example is thinking about phase 1 healthy human volunteer trials, where we test investigational pharmaceuticals for safety and tolerability. These trials, because they're with healthy human volunteers, have no benefit, no health benefit to the people who are involved, but they may harm them in various ways, from common adverse events like headache, nausea, diarrhea, skin rashes, and other problems. And they involve frequent blood draws and other procedures, and they involve confinement in a clinic for days up to weeks. And so some of the ethical issues that are raised here are really pretty human specific in terms of thinking about financial incentives and the worry about exploitation, and in terms of thinking about voluntariness and some potential problems with voluntariness given people's background social situations and the fact that people are paid a significant amount of money in order to participate in these studies. But there are also issues that are raised that really track something very similar to the kinds of ethical issues that are raised in the animal studies, issues about welfare, refinement, and harm. And so I'm doing okay for time. Good. I think sorry, just an aside, what's up on here is different than what's here. Okay. So in terms of thinking about welfare in the clinic, we've got the fact that people are confined to the clinic. They lack freedoms of various sorts, including they're not allowed to exercise typically because of how that changes their bodies. They are sometimes even monitored when they use the bathroom. So there's lots of sort of ways in which their freedom is curtailed in these environments. There are issues with food, quality and quantity. Sometimes you have to eat exactly all that you're given, and sometimes that's not very good or not what you want or not in keeping with your ordinary diet. There are social disruptions, both in terms of family life and being away from family, but also in terms of the potential for tensions within these environments. And sometimes the environments themselves are not ones that people would elect to be in otherwise. So there's welfare issues that are raised by these studies. Similarly, there are issues of refinement. So there are multiple blood draws and sometimes other invasive procedures that happen. So you want to minimize those to the extent possible. And again, because people are healthy, there's the potential for harm, but not the potential for benefit. So I think these two examples, companion animal studies on the one hand and phase 1 human subject trials on the other hand, show that the research structure explanation all by itself doesn't justify the idea that we need these completely different sets of principles. So I don't think any of these justifications work very well in terms of saying why we should have the 3 R's on the one hand and the Belmont principles on the other. So what could the road ahead be, especially because it's not only the case that we sometimes need human subject principles in thinking about animal subject research, but it's also the case that sometimes we need animal subject research principles in thinking about human subject trials. All right, well, let's go back now to the One Health idea and thinking about why that's supposed to be important. And I think it's really striking that there are very different ways that this is sometimes portrayed. So in this visual graph here, which comes from the CDC, you see this idea of, well, people are living closer together. There are changes in the climate and land use with clear cutting, right, and fires. We're traveling all around and doing more global trade. And you can also see animals in zoos. They're not just food. And this is supposed to be why One Health is important. And it says, these factors make it easier for diseases to spread between animals and people. And a One Health approach tackles the shared health threats by looking at all angles, human, animal, plant, and environment. But it really seems like in this case, the focus is on the human health, right? The focus is on the human health and how we can do better there, given all of the problems that we're causing in the world in terms of thinking about animals. So because of population growth, because of our contribution to planetary degradation, and because of our interconnectedness, we're more at risk of getting and spreading zoonotic diseases. And so this One Health approach, I think, really is focused on us and takes a kind of an instrumental approach to why we should care about the health of other species and the planet. That's quite different than what you get with the original principles from 2004. So there you get a very different framework. And maybe that's because it was the Wildlife Conservation Society that organized this group. But you get the idea. So the rise of emerging and resurging infectious diseases threatens not only humans and their food supplies and economies, but also the fauna and flora, compromising the critically needed biodiversity that supports the living infrastructure of our world. The earnestness and effectiveness of humankind's environmental stewardship, blah, 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 blah. And so I think you get an approach to One Health that's much more decentered from just thinking about human health and not simply instrumentalizing animal health. So I would hope that we could come up with something a little bit more like that. And so I don't have actually an answer for how to do that. I said I wouldn't be able to, I think this is a job for a commission. But at the very least, I think there are some principles that could be useful to be able to illustrate in some way respect for all subjects of science, to have justice in subject selection, and a kind of a social or interspecies allocation of thinking about justice in harms and benefits, to have harm benefit justification of research in the animal case as well as in the human case, including thinking about the 3 R's, but then to also think separately, not just in terms of justification for research in terms of benefit, but to think separately about the welfare of study participants independently of the sort of justification of the research itself. And then maybe you could have a way that this is sort of, you differentiate depending on needs and interests of subjects. That could be one route. You could think about the structure of the science and how that might imply different specifications. And, potentially we could even say there are different moral statuses that we need to take into account, but I think that ought to be stated and not just an underlying assumption where we don't need to talk about it because we simply have these 2 different types of oversight and we don't have to give any justification for it. And so that is it. Thank you very much.
Yes, no? Yeah, there it is. Okay. Mariah.
Thank you very much for this talk. I'm so excited by the agenda here. I was just thinking, there are some scholars that argue for affording rights to things like natural systems or, even inanimate entities. And I don't know that literature well enough to know whether it's associated with moral status or not, but I was thinking, I wondered if you could get a rights-based argument going without having it go through any appeal to moral status. Can we talk about the rights of different kinds of animals independently of having it be like having the reason for talking about rights being we could just forget about moral status and talk about what do the rights themselves require of us? Does that make sense? I just thought of it.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. I think that typically when we think about rights, we're already in the business of talking about moral status, but it really just kind of depends on what you mean by moral status, right? So moral status is such a tricky 2 words. And so, sometimes what you mean by moral status is just that you're kind of using it to sum up all of the morally significant differences that you're paying attention to. And sometimes what you mean is something sort of more heavy duty in terms of you're actually differentiating between the value of different kinds of beings. And so, for example, you might think about rights just by going through interests. So you might say, well, tigers have an interest in roaming a certain amount of space, and because of that, they have, an interest in a certain kind of freedom that, ought not to be curtailed unless, there's thus and so other things that hold. And so in a certain way, they have a right to freedom, right? So I think it depends on what route you want to take. Yeah, I don't think it would be a way to get a justification of these two different frameworks, but.
Oh, I meant as a justification of a single framework.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And I learned a lot. And I also think you've convinced me that each framework offers something to the other, and maybe that there should be one framework. There were two potential problems or challenges that I could see someone putting to you for the last two cases. So I wanted to get your thoughts about that. The first was for the dogs, the companion animal study. I think the informed consent, of course, wasn't for the dogs didn't give the informed consent. I think the interests were of the dog owners. And so I think informed consent was relevant there, but I think partly because the dog owner pair had a joint interest and the owner was part of that as a human. So that's one. Then the other case, the phase 1 clinical trial, I think there are potential benefits to people in a phase 1 clinical trial that are either real potential health benefits because there is a non-zero probability of a health benefit in a phase 1 trial, and in the sense of deriving meaning from producing contributing to a potential cure for your whatever disease you have.
Great. Okay, last one first. I tried to be specific, but it cannot bear repeating too many times that I'm talking about healthy volunteer phase 1 trials. Yeah. And so otherwise, yes. And for the first example, I think that's important, very important actually, that we're thinking about consent from the human for the use of the dog. But of course, that's what you also need when it comes to, very young children's participation in research. You need consent from the person who's responsible for their welfare in order for them to participate in studies. So I think that there's a similarity there. And there's another interesting question about the extent to which some animals could potentially assent to participation in research, and that's another sort of issue that's been discussed. And so, I could have put that on the table instead, but I think for the pet studies, so the companion animal studies, you absolutely need consent from the owners. But yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I don't know if I really have much of a view about whether we should have one or two frameworks, but I was thinking in terms of explaining the difference. One thing I'm always struck by in these discussions of moral status is how little the difference in our relationship between us and other people and us and other animals are, and how the relational, the fact that we are in different relationships isn't seen as potentially this explanatory difference. And in particular, I was thinking, for instance, that this thought comes up in a couple of places here. For instance, the example of having to take responsibility for the well-being by virtue of being a caretaker. So we have a special directed obligation potentially, which might explain why we have to be caretakers for these animals, which we might not have for just wild animals. And similarly, the stewardship claim in the 2004 statement is a caretaking thing that you could ground that way. And so I was curious what you sort of thought of, thinking about this as ultimately being grounded in our differing relationships to the relevant subjects, that the reason why we have different systems of ethical codes is that we have, seemingly very fundamentally different relationships between us and other people than to, lab animals. And that would also, I think, explain why, dogs seem to occupy a very particular place in this framework where we kind of give them a special status because we also have a very particular kind of relationship with them. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think in some ways that mirrors the structural approach that I suggested. And there, I guess I would say it's similarly true that we have certain kinds of relationships to laboratory animals that are different than the relationships that we have to animals that are used in veterinary research, both because they're at least sometimes patients, and also because they are belong to a household, right, that they're part of. But for that reason, I think that you wouldn't then just say there's a human set of principles and an animal set of principles, because we don't have the same kinds of relationships to all animals or all other people, right? Those differ depending on context. So I think you similarly couldn't argue for a completely different set of principles per se. You'd want more of a context-based, role-based approach to thinking about the obligations that we have in the research settings. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I know you mentioned that the sort of harmonized set at the end is not fully fleshed out, but when you included and we're sort of walking through some of the bioethics principles, I thought about social justice and particularly within the discipline, some discussions around expanding justice in the more traditional bioethics sense to include social justice. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about maybe how including a social justice perspective in your sort of more unified framework, like what that would look like in terms of humans and animals. Thanks.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. And I haven't given enough thought to have a lot to say about that, but I think it's really relevant, even in thinking just about sort of critically about the way in which the principle of justice in the Belmont report has been sort of interpreted in the regulations, in thinking about harms to subjects instead of harms to communities. So I think we want to sort of move beyond that way of thinking about justice. We want to think not just about sort of potential benefits for the individual and society weighed against the potential risks to the subjects, but we want to think about risks also to the subjects' communities that they're involved in and how those balance against potential benefits, and think about benefits also as being partly defined by the communities themselves. So I think there's a way in which we could bring that to bear, and it might be spelled out quite differently depending on whether you're talking about human or animal subjects. But I don't see why we couldn't think about risks and harms to species, for example, instead of just thinking about individual animals. But I think we would think about it very differently in terms of community engagement, right? Because, in terms of human subjects, we want community engagement in terms of defining what are the benefits that we're looking for, and those would be quite different. So it would have to be contextualized, I think. But very helpful question, thank you.
Can I add one thing to that since I have the microphone? I would imagine that zoos feel that way about the research that they do, right? There's been this shift in zoos and what zoos take themselves to be doing that's more about animal conservation.
Mm-hmm.
And they certainly do, I think on the
that's right.
species level.
I think that's right. And that's really helpful to the point here about specification of relationships and roles. So you might want something that's really contextual all the way down, but that's going to get really messy from an oversight point of view. So it's a bit of a balance.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I just wonder what one ethic, like the implication of one ethics towards, like toxicity studies, something like LD50, because, in my perspective, it's just, not possible, like any kind of toxicity studies, I guess. And I just wonder how to, gonna cope with it, because it is not possible that we don't do any type of LD50s or any type of toxicity test when we develop any new type of treatment or drugs. So just wondered.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So I think one of the big worries is, look, part of the reason why we have these different oversight systems is because we have needs in terms of the science, in terms of the use of animals, that requires use of them, that it just would be completely unacceptable in terms of use of humans. And that I think is something to think about, and partly why I suggested at the end that if we want to say there's differences in moral status, that we need to say that and have that be part of the framework. But I also think, in terms of my understanding, at least, was that we didn't really do LD50 studies anymore, or at least that we were trying pretty hard not to do them and sometimes did them anyway. But arguably that's something we should move away from. And I think there's been work in trying to improve toxicity studies to be less lethal. Of course, they can't not be lethal, but to be less harmful in terms of their use of animals. But it's a very important question. So thank you.
Okay, great. So I was completely convinced by all of your debunking of potential justifications for two systems. And so I'm very inspired to try to look for a single justification in a single unified ethical framework. So I'm still searching for that. To clarify for the recording, that's what I wanted to do with mentioning rights. But also I was thinking about why is it wrong to dominate other beings? Right? There must be many theories of that, but that might be another way into a sort of unified justification for a research ethics that covers all species, including humans. And I am certainly no expert on indigenous worldviews at all. However, I think there are a lot of resources there regarding ethics of non-domination that pertain across all kinds of animals, human and non-human, and natural systems as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I don't have a response. I just have to go looking. Yeah.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you again for coming to speak with us, and please join me in thanking her.
Thanks, everyone.